Okay, this week's Inside the Lords, just as we break up for the Easter recess. So to recap a few things that have happened over the last few weeks. A lot of people ask me why or how I choose which pieces of legislation to follow. The one thing to clarify is that I'm not a political party. I'm a one-person, non-affiliated peer. So I have to choose those bills that I can cover. I can't split myself in half and cover all of them. And sometimes it's obvious politically why I do so. Sometimes it's because of personal passions or interests. And I actually think that's an important consideration, not just to tick political boxes, but to pursue issues that I've had a long time interest in. So I've been following the mental health bill, which started in the House of Lords, will now go on to the Commons. And the mental health bill is a complete revamp. It is a complete revamp of the way that we make decisions about people who are detained or sectioned under the law. Very important considerations are being taken as to whether there's too much locking people up when they don't need to be locked up. And it also covers issues around prisons and police stations being used as places of safety for people who were really ill, but they're dumped in prison. So there's a lot of things that I'm interested in there because I've long been interested in prison reform. And one of my amendments at report stage, this final stage in the Lords, I wanted to talk about those prisoners who have suffered mental ill health inside, and then they get thrown out into the community, and very often they fall through the system, then they deteriorate, and guess what? We have a situation where they end up being detained or sectioned because they get very ill because they've no longer got any continuity of care. So that's one issue that I picked up this week. The second one is around mental ill health, and it's, in my opinion, overdiagnosis. Now, this is proven to be far more controversial than I imagined, but when I wrote my book on free speech, I find that offensive. One of the things that I looked at in that is that young people in particular seem to have less resilience when it comes to feeling uncomfortable around certain ideas or words even, or why were they running to safe spaces. And I argue in that book, and this was based on being a mental health social worker many years before that, that there was a tendency to pathologise and medicalise conditions, and young people were picking up the language of therapeutic interventions, mental ill health, and seeing themselves as not able to cope, and therefore not going out and boldly arguing against views that they didn't agree with, but rather hiding away from them and saying that actually even being exposed to those views would make them mentally ill. Since then, there's been an increase in not just mental ill health, but a demand for new diagnosis in relation to neurodiversity. A lot of that, of course, is because we know more about neurodiversity, so it's not all a made-up contagion of any sort. But nonetheless, the figures in relation to ADHD are enormous in terms of the numbers of people who are waiting for diagnosis. And why this affects this particular piece of legislation is that if the idea of the mental health bill is that people who are very poorly should only be sent into incarcerated situations and sectioned in mental health secure hospitals if they are absolutely necessary, but where possible should be kept in community settings and treated, then everybody says, well, the problem is the community services for mental health and for autistic related, neurodivergent related conditions are drowning in over referrals. There's not enough capacity and so on. So I wanted to call for a review as to whether there's a danger that the overdiagnosis, which is more likely to be a social than a medical issue, was actually getting in the way of us fulfilling the aims of the bill. So I called for a review. So I did that speech. That was what was driving me on. I can't tell you how much abuse I've had for this speech. This is the second time I've spoken, or maybe the third, in this bill on this issue. My speech yesterday has particularly incensed everyone. I'm drowning in abuse from people who think that I'm cruel, not understanding about ADHD and so on and so forth. What qualifications have I got? And it's just interesting because I don't consider necessarily this bill to be a political bill in a straightforward political way, but actually I have had more abuse on this than even when I stood as a Brexit Party candidate. So you'd be amazed what winds people up. But what was interesting was when I did my speech in the House of Lords, to take it back to that, I was also surprised that there was a whole range of Labour lords and baronesses who were particularly agitated by my intervention. I had Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, of all people, who hasn't even been following the bill, sitting there going, shame, shame, disgrace, disgrace. I was thinking, what's agitated her? It's not even a topic I thought that she'd be interested in. And of course, I was citing, apart from anything else, Wes Streeting, who has said that there's a problem of overdiagnosis recently. Tony Blair has said, so I was hardly being sectarian because I was citing these great Labour figures to back up my case, as well as, of course, medical expertise as well. And what it made me realise is, and one thing to just report to you, is that the Labour benches are what can only be described as in a bad mood. The Labour peers, you can imagine a situation, everything that they hold dear is being overturned by their own government, and they're really thrown by this. So Shami Chakrabarti is actually really not angry with me at all. She's angry with the Health Secretary for cutting back on welfare payments to the disabled in the recent statements, the attack on PIPs. And she's as furious about that as anything, but she wants to kind of lash out and take it out on other people. I've just done a question, a very quick question on the Sentencing Council and the guidelines. And again, I was commending the Justice Secretary for her decision to legislate so that there would not be differential treatment at sentencing of people because of their ethnicity, their faith, their culture, or what have you. You know, justice should be blind, and in this instance it definitely is not. It's playing the identitarian game. I was therefore commending the government for its decision. And guess what? The Labour benches were up in arms. They are absolutely furious, but they're furious with their own front bench. They can't believe that their views or their identitarian way of looking at the world is being shaken up by their own government. So I think they're all over the place. A similar thing happened when there was a debate on the government's intervention into encryption. This was slightly different. In this instance, the government have tried to open up a backdoor, demand that Apple allow a way into encrypted messages, our private messages. And the Labour benches don't know what to do because all those human rights lawyers that populate the Labour benches are not sure how to handle the fact that their own government is being so reactionary when it comes to things which they themselves would have said were Tory authoritarian measures in the past and now have to accept it's part of their own government's strategy. Just on that, I think as a consequence of that, the Labour government are being torn in all different directions, and one thing that they're trying to do is to smooth the ways through a number of things which will be popular. One of them is through their review of anti-Muslim hate, the Islamophobia Commission. And so it was interesting yesterday because I went to a briefing on the Anti-Muslim Hate Commission by the Noble Lord Khan from the Labour front bench. And that particular meeting was incredibly acrimonious because it's just been announced that all of the people on this commission investigating setting up a definition of Islamophobia are going to be Muslims. And some of us queried why that was, apart from Dominic Grieve, by the way, which is slightly odd. But anyway, apart from Dominic Grieve. And on the one hand, the answer was, well, Muslims are the only people who understand this particular issue. I then said, well, what's Dominic Grieve doing there then? And isn't this just playing identity politics? It assumes that this is not an objective issue to be assessed as to how you deal with it, but is actually in many ways pandering to a different identity group, but is bound to be divisive and going to be seen as a particular special protection for one particular group. Inevitably, people raise the issue of anti-Semitism, and I just want to state here, I think the official definition of anti-Semitism is equally as dangerous and potentially censorious and chilling for free speech. When I pointed out that having a definition wouldn't stop the rise of anything, because we have a definition of anti-Semitism and the amount of anti-Semitic Jew hatred is gone through the roof since we've had the definition, there can hardly be a justification for coming up with an official guidance and definition that will be incorporated into every institution in the country, and is bound to mean that people are very wary of what they say in public. So that's interesting, but it's obvious that from the Labour Party's point of view, this is, as it were, a policy which is going to keep some of the disgruntled backbenchers happy. That is, it seems to me, to be cynical what's going on. I think the same is also true of the Employment Rights Bill, by the way. This is a bill which I am pursuing. I spoke at second reading. You can see the speech below. I was picking up on the fact that the trade unions, which will be given enhanced rights in the Employment Rights Bill, and in theory, I would agree that that is perfectly reasonable. I've got no problem with trade unionism. I was a trade union rep for many a year. I've organised plenty of strikes over the years. But I am worried that the trade unions at the moment have, for example, sold out gender critical members, whether you look at the way UCU treated Kathleen Stock at Sussex University, or the way at the present time two academics are actually suing the UCU for throwing them under the bus when they made a film about gender critical questions, and the UCU stopped the showing of the film over a period of time and demonised those academics. So I raised that, but the thing that's really hilarious about the House of Lords is there's like mass ranks of Labour peers. There's something like 66 people speaking in this debate, and everybody reverted to form. You know, the Tories sounded like some Thatcherite throwback, you know, anti-trade union, you know, employees' rights are going to be disastrous, going to destroy business everywhere. And the Labour benches sounded as though they were kind of 1970s, 1980s trade union militants. And then I looked at them and I thought, oh, you all are. Because I then realised that 3 members of the House of Lords were General Secretaries of the Trade Union Council, of the TUC. Everybody else who spoke from trade unions had run, I don't know, the union, the Education Union, or Unite, or Unison. In other words, they were all trade union bureaucrats. And what I intend to do is to make a point that trade union bureaucrats are not the same as trade union members. That actually the rank and file and ordinary workers in this country are not represented by people who were leading trade unions as a full-time bureaucratic position, and that actually we should differentiate. So I don't want to be on the side of the Tories, who, let's be honest, are not entirely always sympathetic to the working classes, but I definitely don't want to side with the trade union leaders either. But it's no doubt that the Labour government feels that this Employment Rights Bill will shut up the angry backbenchers who can't go along with a lot of the cuts that are inevitably going to have to come with an austerity set of policies that we can see happening as we speak. Just to finish off with a couple of small things. One of the things that's quite exciting was I was asked by the House magazine, which is the in-house parliamentary magazine, to write a book review of Ash Sarkar's book on identity politics, ironically, called Minority Rule. And it was quite an enjoyable experience taking on the best and the worst of Ash's ideas on this. But for me, at least, it was a first to get in the House magazine, and it was very nice to be asked if I would write more for the House magazine. So I used to write for all sorts of publications. I don't do as much writing now, but I intend to carry that on, take them up on that. And the other thing that happened in the House of Lords that was a bit unusual recently was that Debating Matters came into the House of Lords, and we had 4 schools fighting it out, with 5th guest school fighting it out to be the House of Lords Debating Matters champion. I was very pleased to be there, and I was reminded that young people arguing, when they are given the background material on both sides of the argument, can sometimes make a much better fist of it than some of the debates that I hear in the House of Lords chamber. One of the things that really struck me when I was listening to that for and against was the importance of not heckling the other side or not being Tory, Labour or so on, but actually having proper debates, thoughtful debates, something that we don't have enough of. And I think that everybody in politics is guilty of actually preaching to the choir and not speaking across the aisle and really trying to understand issues. So in that spirit, the last thing that I'm going to do, which was organised for me, is I'm on Monday evening going to be doing an in conversation with Mark Littlewood from PopCon, Popular Conservatives. And I think that we won't agree on very much, but I think having those conversations is well worth pursuing, because we need to talk to people we don't always agree with. And in fact, it's a real shame that I can't do the same with Ash Sarkar, because I don't want it to just be, I'm prepared to talk to the right. I want to talk to anybody and everybody, and because actually the world is falling apart, and we could do with having people discussing what's the best way to solve some of those problems.